Okay, welcome everyone. I'll be talking today about the art of asking questions. Probably most of us ask questions in our daily lives, but it's not always easy to ask the right question in the right way. So hopefully this talk will give you some pointers on how to do that. So first off, who am I? So my name is Rinze. I've been doing research for quite a long while now already. I started out at a couple of universities and then I ended up at an agency called Internet Architects, who now became part of the IO family. Also, I am Dutch and more specifically from Friesland. That's the flag from Friesland. And fun random fact, the things that people always think are hearts on the flag, they're actually lily leaves. So how did I come up with this presentation? Well, a big inspiration is this book, The Art of Asking Questions, by Stanley Payne. It's a book from the 1950s, so it's already really old. It still has a lot of relevant information in there. Sometimes the topics aren't necessarily that relevant anymore. For instance, there's an example I'm going to use that is about radio repairman. Okay, not a lot of those around anymore, but the way he thinks about asking questions, and especially the fact that he tested different types of questions and then see how was the response to those questions if you change a couple of words. Still very interesting, and there isn't a lot about that on the internet. There's a lot about the importance of asking the right questions, but not that much of A/B testing really with questions. So just to paint a bit of a picture, you're working on a project and you need some input, let's say on how to implement image zoom. So what do? Well, you ask a question, and because we're all UXers here, of course we ask this question to our users, potential users. Now you know all about the importance of representativity, and you know a bit about statistics, and you have some time and budget, so you ask 100 representative users. You ask them, do you prefer to use gesture-based interaction to zoom in on images? So you do the survey, 80% of your users say yes, so you implement the gesture-based control image zoom. Solid research, right? You've done a good job and you did great. Well, not quite, and why we will see in a bit. So how do you improve on this? Well, there's three things. One, thinking about actionability, validity, and reliability. Then the art of asking questions, so the way you ask your questions, the way you phrase your questions, and then finally the question types that you use. Now, all of these three could be a talk on their own, so I'm briefly going to do the first and third part, but the focus will be mainly on the questions part. Right, so actionability, validity, reliability. First off, what is important, why do you want to measure? Why do you want to ask a question? Before you start asking questions to your users, first ask a couple of questions to yourself and make sure that you know what is the reason that you want to do some research. What are the questions that you want answers to, and very important, what will help you get to the next step of your project? What kind of input do you need to get value out of the research you do? And therefore it's important to come up with a set of research questions for yourself. They don't have to be very formal like in scientific research, but just challenge yourself a bit to think about, okay, what answers do I really want? What will help me in my project? Then when you have those questions for yourself, it's time to think about, okay, and what kind of instrument do do I want to use to ask these questions? You can do interviews, you can do a survey, you can do, for instance, a focus group, but depends on what kind of data you want. Are you in exploratory phase? Then probably a couple of interviews will help you out. Are you trying to fact check some stuff? Then you probably could do with a survey to get some quantitative data. But of course, it's also important, who do you want to ask, and if you have the time and or budget to do so. Then next important part is the reliability of your instrument. So you want to make sure that when you ask a couple of questions, when you use a survey, that the answers that come back are reliable, that if you would repeat that survey, that the same answers come back. Of course, if you want to be really sure, you have to test and retest, but not everybody has time for that. But if you make sure that your questions are solid, then the chances of you having a reliable instrument are already pretty good. The next up is validity. That is, are you actually measuring what you think you are measuring? The fact that you get the same responses every time doesn't mean that you are actually measuring what you think you're measuring. Think back of the question from the start. Do you prefer to use gesture-based interaction to zoom in on images? Maybe the people, you're building it for a mobile application, but maybe the people you ask this question have a desktop environment in mind when they think, when they answer your question. So they might say no, but if you would have specified that it's about a mobile application, they would have said yes. Or maybe they don't even know what a gesture-based interaction means, and they just answer yes or no based on the fact that they really have no clue what they are answering. So you get an answer, but is it actually the answer that you're looking for? It's also why using existing validated surveys can be very convenient, because someone did all the hard work for you. But of course, chances that the exact question you want to ask, that there's already an instrument available for that, are not always that big. So that brings us to the art of asking questions, coming up with good questions yourself. And the first thing we're going to look at is words. And words matter. The most critical need for attention to wording is to make sure that the particular issue which the questioner has in mind is the particular issue on which the respondent gives their answer. It's a bit of a complicated quote, but it's basically coming back to what I mentioned before. Are the people who are answering your question, do they have the same thing in mind that you asking the question had in mind? So is there a match there? Do you get the answer you're expecting? And to show that words matter, for instance, take this question. Do you think anything should be done to make it easier for people to pay doctor or hospital bills? Now you could also have gone with, do you think anything could be done to make it easier for people to pay doctor or hospital bills? And another variation might be, do you think anything might be done to make it easier for people to pay doctor or hospital bills? Now these first glance all look more or less like the same question, asking more or less the same thing. Of course, if they're underneath each other like this with a specific word highlighted, probably you're already thinking, well, they're not quite the same. And indeed, if you look at it, then the first is more or less about the moral need. The second one is about, can it be done? And the last one is more about, will it be done? But if you ask this question to people, and this is one of the examples I talked before, you will see that agreement with this depends quite a lot. There is a big difference, especially between the first two and the last one, in how people agree with it. So just one word in your question can make a lot of difference in the response you get back. Another example, do you think the United States should allow public speeches against democracy, or do you think the United States should forbid public speeches against democracy? So it's basically the same thing, but it's should allow or should forbid. So you would expect the answers on this one to be similar in agreement, but the other way around. But then if you actually look at the results, so in the first question, 21% said should allow, but in the second one, 39% said should not forbid. So that's almost double the people who would then be against forbidding this kind of speeches. So again, you see just a tiny word. Maybe it's because it's an American question, that forbidding something is really not done, even if it's allowing or forbidding arguing against free speech. That's probably what has to do with it. But again, shows the way you ask your question can make a big difference in the results, the answers you get back. So a few more. Here you have one. What do you say? What would you say the major is doing all he can do for the city? So you already have an idea what the problem is with this one. Maybe if I give another example, do you always follow traffic rules? Anyone got an idea what the problem is here? Yeah, also, but actually it's, if you have one more. Yes, it's indeed, it's too absolute. So, because do you always follow traffic rules? Well, you usually follow traffic rules, right? But sometimes there is no one else on the street, there is a red light, but you're like, okay, there's no one else here, so I'm just gonna cross this. And the same thing with the others. Would you say the major is doing everything he could do? Well, he's doing a really good job, but maybe you could do still a little more. So be careful with that. With absolutes, almost always you get some people being clever and think, well, it's not about everyone, so I'll answer in a negative way. And a small variation on that is comparing things. For instance, you have a solution, you say like, okay, do you think any solution is better than a currently proposed solution? Well, there's probably some solution that is better, right? So I will say that, no, I don't like this solution, come up with something better. And you may discount something that was actually quite highly rated, just not against the hypothetical any other thing. So another one, here's the thing from the radio repairman survey. So they asked like, how many radio sets did you repair last month? So what could be the problem here? It's probably not the word you expect, but the problem here was actually the you, because who does you refer to? When they tried this question, a lot of radio repairmen answered as their office. They repaired thousands of radios in a month, which would be impossible for a single individual. But of course, others answered as a single individual, and then you had two sets of data, and you weren't sure like who answered as an individual, who answered for their whole company. And so basically, all the results you got from this question were pretty useless. Another one, is there much rivalry between stores who sell ice cream and burgers? Yes, exactly. Like the end, like which rivalry are we talking about here? Is it between stores who sell both ice creams and burgers? They are having rivalry amongst themselves? Or is there rivalry between burger selling stores and ice cream selling stores? So even just the inconspicuous and can be difficult if you don't specify it well enough. You can just, the and implies something, and if you don't specify it, people will interpret it in different ways, and again, you get different answers based on that interpretation, and after the fact, you won't know who answered in which way, so it becomes really hard to do something with the data you've gathered. Also, if you ask how would you rate this design, good, fair, poor, okay, good, poor is pretty okay, but you need something in the middle. here it's fair, but for some people fair is pretty good. For others it's only fair. So how will this middle answer be interpreted? It's difficult. So it's really important that you think about the words. Other options, there's actually done some research about good middle words. Average, moderate, and between seem to be the most neutral middle words you can use. Another one, do you know about two-factor authentication? That's actually multiple issues here. For instance, two-factor authentication, does everybody know what that means? But also the main thing here was the word know. For some people, knowing is, okay, I've heard about two-factor authentication, so yes. But for others, it's like, well, I've heard about it, but I can't really explain how it works, so I say no to this question. And again, because people interpret the question in very different ways, the result that you get won't be reliable. You don't know what you've actually measured here. So, for instance, what would be better is just asking, have you ever heard about two-factor authentication? And then for people who say yes, do you feel that you would be comfortable explaining how it works? And then you can do it in that way, for instance. Or where did you first hear about us? Hearing about us, that also implies already, okay, I watched a commercial about you, but did I hear about it? Again, a difficult one. Also, be careful with expressions. When did you last go to town? Okay, does that mean that you went to town, just visited the city, or that you had a really crazy night out? Again, be careful. Always think, okay, what does it mean? Could it mean something different? And how will people interpret my question? How satisfied are you with our service? So what is service? What is that the process I just went through? Or is it if I got a smile, for instance, I'm at the airport, is it just getting the ticket, presenting it, checking in? Or is it how friendly the staff was at the moment? It's a very vague word. And finally, should the government control the electric plants? Okay, what is government? Do we mean the national government, a local government, especially here in Belgium? It could be a lot of different kinds of government. And how will I answer this question? Maybe I think it's a good idea if the federal government would take control, but I wouldn't like my city government to take control, for instance. So how do I answer this question? So what should you take away from it? For every word, think, does it mean what you intend? And then think, could it have any other meanings? If so, does the context make it clear enough which meaning I had in my mind, which one I'm after? Does a simpler word or phrase exist that conveys the same meaning? And here it's also important to know your audience. Like, can you use a word like two-factor authentication, or do you have to explain what that is? Ideally, you run a pilot test where you go with a few people, have them go through your questions and see, okay, how do they answer them? Do they interpret them in the same way you did? But of course, it's not always possible because it takes extra time. But at least really think about the words you use. So the next part, it's related to this, but it's about definitions and assumptions you make. For instance, take this question. How many bedrooms does your house have? Could be the problem here. Well, yeah, that's also pretty good. But here I was actually going for the word bedroom. What constitutes a bedroom? For instance, is a home office, is that a bedroom? If you mean any room that is not a living room, bathroom, or kitchen, then you probably have to specify that, because for some people, every room indeed in the house, like a home office, that is a bedroom. You just use it as a home office. But for other people, every room that doesn't have a bed is not a bedroom. So if you ask about this, again, results that you will get back will differ very much from person to person, and you almost can't use the results that you get back. Another one, and this is one example again from the book. I don't think there's a lot of ammonia usage still or producers, but this was one that came from there. Which house, there was an ammonia producer, and they were really curious, like, okay, how many households already use ammonia as a disinfectant? So they asked this question, and they got this really discouraging result. Only 1% of people that got this survey answered that yes, they use ammonia as a disinfectant. But then they tried again, and they made the question to which bottled disinfectant, antiseptic, or bleaches do you use? And now all of a sudden 40% of households used ammonia. So maybe if they even changed it just to plainly asking about do you use ammonia, the results would have been even bigger. But again, it goes to show you that if you would have just relied on that first result and thought like, okay, we can scrap our ammonia production because nobody is using it, then you would have actually been really wrong just because you didn't think enough about your question. Another thing, what happens a lot is using the language from your inside perspective. For instance, if you want to know about your customers, with which division do they interact? Well, okay, your divisions are called industry, tunnel, and construction, but do your customers know this? And do they know who they interact with? If you ask, do you have a variable or fixed energy contract? Okay, do you know what is variable and what is fixed? Some people probably do, others do not. Or maybe if they know, they might not know which of the two they actually have themselves. Same thing, are you consuming gray or green energy? I don't know, what's gray energy, what's green energy, and which one do I have? Do I even care? So again, you can't assume that people think of things in the same way you do. Yeah, exactly. And it's a difficult one to think about because it's usually happens when you're least aware of it, because you assume that everybody knows what is green and gray energy, right? I mean, especially now with a lot of things about sustainability, energy efficiency, everybody knows what this means, right? But maybe they don't. And the thing is, people are inclined to answer questions even if they don't know some of the words in that question. So if you ask them about gray or green, people will probably guess at one of the two. Already helps if you add an option to say, I don't know, but not everybody will select that. So how to circumvent the problem? Well, ask yourself for every question, what is being taken for granted here? And as I mentioned before already on an example, you can try and use filter questions. At first ask about, have you ever heard of this? Then how well do you know it? What would you say it is? And in this way you can get an understanding if people actually know about the concepts that you're talking about or asking about. And third, isn't that loaded? So if I ask you, do you feel all right? Or if I ask you, did you forget something? What happens? Well, before you weren't thinking about, did you forget something? But now you're thinking, did I forget something? And before you felt pretty well, but now you're like, maybe I also have a little bit of an ache in my stomach or something. So just asking a question already influences someone. And with these, it's pretty innocent, but the way you ask a question can have a big impact on how people will answer that question. For instance, this is an example I came across. Thank you, Bavo. Do you understand the importance and value of cultural creative education for your children? Yes, no, not sure. Well, it basically already, do you understand it? So it's going to be hard pressed for you to say no to this question, right? And then it got followed up by, do you agree that creative education and creative thinking does not relate to art only, but can be applied to any other subject and is a very important skill? Okay, how many people do you think would answer strongly disagree to this question? So how could you have done that otherwise? So there's actually another problem in this one. It's also basically asking two questions in one question, which is also something that's not good to do. I'll mention it again in a bit later. But for instance, you could have started with, do you think creative thinking is a relevant skill outside of art? And then followed up with, how important do you think creative thinking is as a skill? Are they completely neutral? Probably not, but it's already a lot easier to disagree with the statements here than the statements before. So other things to look out for with respect to the neutrality of your questions, framing. So if you ask, do small businesses need a government as a wet nurse in all its daily activities? Well, you're making it sound so negative that probably everybody will say no. And indeed, on this question, 97% answered no. But for instance, if you would frame it like, do you think that small businesses could do with a little bit more government oversight? Probably you would get a completely different result than this one. Another thing to take or be aware of is the status quo. If you frame things as the way they already are, a lot of people will just go along with the way they are and just answer that way. So watch out with, as you know, according to the law, or as it is now, because a lot of people tend to just agree with how things are today and they won't answer from their own perspective anymore. Hypotheticals is also always a difficult one. If I ask, if you were looking for a job, which company would you apply to? So it's a hypothetical question, but for a lot of people, they might just answer, they won't answer their favorite company because they know that company isn't hiring at this moment, or they feel they don't have enough experience yet to go to that company. So they would mention a company that's not their most preferred company, but one that is based more in realism. So try and always put your questions as factual as possible. For instance, here you could have asked, where did you apply last time you were looking for a job? But of course, that could be outdated. So here another solution would be to make it completely hypothetical and say, if you were looking for a job and any company you can think of was hiring, which company would you apply to? And so already make sure that everybody is taking into account every company and that there aren't some people who are taking the question almost too seriously and discounting companies they know that aren't hiring. Another one, stereotypes. Some people are so triggered by some people or companies or concepts that they will immediately disagree with whatever follows. If you start something with Trump beliefs or oil concerns would like, doesn't matter what follows, a lot of people will already discount that opinion. Or for instance, it can even happen with worse. If you use welfare, especially in the United States, it has such a negative connotation that anything to do with welfare will be disagreed with. For instance, if you ask like, I think welfare for poor people should be increased, a lot of more people would say no than if you, for instance, frame it as, do you think we should give more assistance to the poor? Actually, did some research a long time ago against political opinions, and I looked there at a previous study and it had statements made by either Bush or Clinton, but they had random statements and they just swapped them around, and depending on your affiliation you would see that people who would lean Democrats, no matter if the idea was actually from Clinton, but you framed it as being from Bush, they would be very negative against it, while the same people, if you framed it as being from Clinton, they would be very positive against it. So just because you have already a feeling with a person or thing can very much influence your opinion. So try to avoid those terms, if you can, of course. That giveaway, so we already talked about it. If you frame things in absolutes, people will, of course, disagree. Do you think there are researchers who would make up statistics? Well, of course there are. I mean, there's been plenty of cases in the paper, but if you would say, do you generally think researchers make up statistics, then probably you get a completely different answer. At least I hope you would get a different answer. Also be aware that you can, even if your question itself is pretty neutral, what's your favorite TV show? But if in that same survey before you asked or mentioned Breaking Bad, then that will definitely influence the feedback you get on this pretty neutral question. All right, so that's for question neutrality. Then quickly, some other things to look out for. Mentioned it already. Had a double-barreled questions, basically 2 questions in one. Are you a hardworking employee who is never late? How do you answer this question? If you consider yourself very hardworking, but every now and then you are actually late for work, how do you answer this question? You can't really, so never bundle 2 questions in one, because it's impossible to answer. Asking about too much detail, how many books do you have on your bookshelf? Nobody knows this, so you gotta keep things realistic. Also, if you ask like, how many eggs did you cook last year? Yeah, nobody knows this, but you can maybe ask about how many eggs do you usually consume in a week, and then people have an idea of how much that would be. Extensive questions is also a nice example. So they asked in a survey at the end, is there anything about the company on which you would like more information? And in a second version of that survey at the end, so they were open questions, they asked, would you like to know more about other departments in the company? So the first one is basically, it can be anything. And it's such an overwhelming question for people that not a lot of people answered it. But in the second version, because you make it more specific, actually people had more an idea. So if you looked at it, on the first one, only 28% of people put something in that answer box. On the second one, actually, almost 70% of people put something in the answer box. So you have to also be careful with how wide or narrow you phrase your question. Another small thing, antecedent. So what do you think about this? So what does this refer to? Even if it's something you just mentioned, it's always difficult for people to know exactly what you're referring to. So sometimes it can work, but usually it's much safer to just repeat the thing this is referring to. Examples, another thing to take care of. If you ask, do you think that leafy vegetables like spinach should be in the daily diet? Now, people who really hate or really love spinach will probably answer this in quite a different way than if you wouldn't have named spinach as an example in this question. And specificity, if you ask about, do you like Gold brand apples? Now, if you really like apples, maybe you never heard about Gold, you probably will say yes, and Gold brand might interpret this as, oh, everybody loves Gold brand apples, but no, they just really love apples. Then another thing, it's less of an issue with anonymous surveys or questionnaires, but prestige and social desirability. People tend to give answers they feel are socially desirable. And also a very important one, everybody feels the need to give an opinion when asked for one. Even if you don't really know or care about it, people will still give you an opinion on something. Adding a no opinion option helps, but usually people are prone to give an opinion if they have an idea what it's about or not. Then very briefly, question types. So the way you let your respondents answer a question is part of your question. Many different types of question, but very quickly, very rough. You can have an open question, or you can have a closed question, a multiple choice question, or a yes/no question. Benefits of the first, well, of course, it's uninfluenced. You don't present options that people can pick from, but they have to dig in their own memory. You get a wide variety of responses, but of course they are harder for people to answer, and the analysis of these kind of questions takes a lot of work. So it's much better to use this in an ideation phase when you're just looking at, so to get some ideas, some input, and then maybe afterwards, if you want to validate something, look at a closed question. Benefits there is no answer option is overlooked. If you ask an open question, sometimes the most popular opinion is not really mentioned because people didn't really think about it. But of course, that's also immediately the downside, because anything you don't mention can also not be an answer on the case. So it takes more from you to make sure that if you ask a multiple choice question, that all answers that you want to know about are actually there. And of course, because of that, there is more steering going on, and also people can just guess at an answer even if they don't really have a clue what the question was about. All right, tijd hoor ik, maar that's also okay because this was my last slide. Main takeaways, think carefully about what it is that you want to learn, what you want to ask before you start asking questions to people. Words matter, be careful with assumptions, try to keep your questions as neutral as possible. Use the appropriate question time. If you can, pilot test your study. And if you really want to go overboard, ask multiple versions of your question in the same study and then compare the results in the end. But yeah, I have to admit, even I don't really get the opportunity to do that a lot. So yeah, that's it. So any questions?
Thanks so much. No, that was really insightful, and I love so many examples. That's such a great way to explain the concepts. And I assume that you're the type of person who does user test a user test before you user test.
Yeah, I try to do as much as possible. If time allows it, then okay. Yes, I try to always pilot test the stuff I'm running.
And do you just use coworkers, or do you also?
That's a good option. Like yeah, indeed, you can use coworkers, or what also always works is use mom or dad. You know, like just use some people you know. Mm-hmm. Of course, it's even better to also do it with a couple of actual users. But even those kind of quick tests just have another perspective, and people saying like, what does this mean? That will already get you to the idea that okay, this question still needs some work.
Cool, cool. All right, well, thank you so much for your presentation. Right. I think we're going to take a break because there's a lot of food over there and we've got the next speakers coming up. So if you have questions, please leave them for the break or afterwards. We'll be around the whole evening, I assume, to talk to people. So if you have a question, bring it to us, Rinze individually. And let's come back at about 8:05. There's still some food on the, there's a heating rack under here, so it's still pretty warm. If Gregory is still back there, let's give a round of applause for Gregory, the chef. It's amazing. Some of the best food we've ever had at UX Beers, which is great. And we'll see you back at 8:05 for the second talker. Thanks.